Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture on alternative development. This lecture is a part of your paper on development communication. This module, alternative development, is basically a reaction to all previous development models as it assimilates the various emphases of the former models. Introduction. Through our previous modules, we have got one concrete idea: the dependency theorist and post-colonialist grassroots workers, world system academics, feminists, environmentalists and others have their respective articulated ideas for the future. Groups like social ecologists argue for a balance in the nature and society. But what is common in these diverse views is the criticism of ethnocentrism of the dominant discourse and forced imposition of modernization structure on the indigenous knowledge structures and cultures. Alternative development approaches call for participatory democracy and locally viable existences with the retrieval of people's subjugated knowledge. Development communication scholars, after a series of empirical research and self-critique, began to question the theoretical assumptions of the previous models of development. Further, the ethnocentric viewpoint of modernizing the indigenous culture advocated by the dominant paradigm was also found to be faulted by the theorists. The concept of alternative development rejects the idea of economism and universal significance of the earlier paradigms of development and is in sync with the non-Marxist approaches. From the above perspectives, we get that the idea of real development was rounded and includes equity and growth, clean environment, education, health, shelter, employment, and balanced relationships within the society and culture. The emphasis of alternative development approaches is basically on the social and cultural identities of countries. It also focuses on the external factors that obstruct all-round development. This new alternative paradigm is known by various names like another development, culturalist models and multiplicity in one world, etc. In this module, we will also be discussing the emergence of another development, communication approaches and other factors shaping the local culture in the development process. Evolution of alternative development. During the 1980s, a number of development scholars were proposing alternative approaches to modernization and dependency models of development. Some of these scholars supporting the alternative culturalist approaches to development were Jane Service, Hamid Maulana, Goran Hadibro, and Majid Tehranian. These communication scholars opined that the emergence of alternative development is a result of the criticism of modernization and dependency paradigms. The alternative development paradigm emerged in the 1970s. Schrem in 1963 noted that it emerged as results of criticism of diffusionist development model and the dominant role of communication in development. In this paradigm, the role of communication that was only limited to inform and influence was revised. It was proposed that communication should be a process of social interaction based on balanced and mutual sharing of information, and as a result, the dimension of participatory approach emerged. The philosophy of dominant paradigm failed to identify the significance and benefits of participatory communication approach. Rogers in 1976 argued that another development model is fundamentally a meta-model that comprised of various alternating pathways to development. One combination or the other of any of the pathways offered by alternative paradigm could prove to be beneficial for developing nations. The basic hypothesis of this alternative approach is that no single country can function autonomously and they cannot be self-sufficient completely. Further, it also assumed that the external factors cannot determine any nation's development. According to this theory, development is a process of social change and every society must be having its own strategy for development. One of the most striking and distinctive presumptions made by this approach is that there are no particular models of development. Paradigms tend to build on each other rather than rejecting each other completely. And thus, a new vision emerged highlighting on the elements that were neglected by earlier models of development. This paradigm was also described as another or multidimensional development. Wang and Desainike in 1984 emphasized that development is basically a process of social change that has its main goal in the improvement of quality of life without causing any harm to the cultural and natural environment. They also stressed on the factor development process seeks the involvement of the majority of the people. In this context, Rogers in 1976 also noted that the uniting dimensions of alternative development is mainly participation of people. Hidebro and Surveys listed 6 basic principles of another development, and these are: the paradigms must fulfill the basic requirements of the majority of the population. It must promote self-reliant and endogenous development, enabling people to define their cultural identities. It must provide scopes for fulfilling the creative needs of the people, maintain the local ecological balance, must provide equitable access to world's natural resources, must emphasize the need for participatory and dialogic communication strategies for development. Social scholars also emphasized on the fact that the alternate paradigm must also stress on the structural changes in the social relations globally. Another development approach emphasizes on 2 basic criteria. Firstly, the problems must be identified by the people themselves. And secondly, it considers culture to be the major facilitating force in development process. Framework of alternative development. As we observed above that there has been a shift in the focus of development in the new alternate paradigm. Rogers in 1976 claimed that this shift can be identified in the social system itself towards the decentralization of power. labor-intensive technology and planning of policies considering the indigenous society and factors in the growth process. As earlier, the focus of development paradigms was only on modernization and industrialization. The shift changed to individuals and their improved quality of life, with the amalgamation of traditional as well as modern values in this particular paradigm. Industrialization. People were encouraged to participate in the decision-making process, development planning and its implementation at the indigenous level. Unlike the dominant paradigm that advocated top-down policy, this model stressed on balanced distribution of economic gain so that the poorer section of the society does not suffer. What we understand from these statements is that this multi-dimensional approach of development is society-specific and is based on communication. Supporters of another development model opine that for the development of any nation, priority should be given to the villagers and urban poor in the development programs. Development program in a village. Before we discuss the objectives of alternative model and the role of communication in it, we will briefly discuss the newer notions of development. This model specifically emphasized on aspects like self-development and self-reliance. With the conception of self-development, what we particularly understand is the concern for making the people involved in the transformation of social structure. For deciding a plan of action for development, information must be obtained from the grassroots level. One of the advantages of self-development approach is that rate of accomplishment is higher and it is considered most appropriate for changing local needs, according to Rogers in 1976. Secondly, in this self-reliance approach, emphasis was given to potential local resources and rejection of the foreign aid. Dissanayake in 1991 viewed self-reliance in this model as a way of minimalizing exploitation of developing countries in the hands of developed nations. So what we notice here is that this particular approach discourages the common propensities of underdeveloped nations to imitate the strategies of Western nations and encourages radical thinking about the possible inferences of development. The alternative model of development also deals with the construction of the communication effects gap. We have learned about the gap in the distribution of benefits of socio-economic development. But this model noted that there exists an information and knowledge gap between the haves and the have-nots. Scholars are of the opinion that the communication effects gap can severely influence the course of development. From the previous discussions, we derive a pluralistic approach of development, and we can sum up the goals of development as per alternative model in the following points. Full participation of people at all levels. This model ensured that the people at the grassroots level actively participate in the development process and their voices must be heard. It was argued by the postmodernism scholars that efforts of involving people at the decision-making course will revitalize the local and subjugated power systems. It will also open up possibilities of reconstructing the developing nations. Balanced distribution of development benefits. This paradigm emphasized that the poorest of poor remain at the exploited, and because of the increasing gap between the advantaged and the disadvantaged, this gap can be reduced by ensuring equity in the distribution of development and information benefits. Integration of traditional ideas into modern systems. Unlike the earlier models, the alternative paradigm did not consider that local traditional culture needs to be discarded for attaining development. In fact, this model facilitated the blend of old and new elements for the betterment of a particular community. It believed in the idea that the unique synchronization of the nation wisdom with critical modernism can actually benefit any particular community. Self-reliance of local communities. This approach to development supported the fact that the local communities with their skills and resources can foster development without any external assistance. Role of communication in alternative development paradigm. The discussion so far suggested that communication and participation are essential factors for development. Rogers in 1976 pointed out that the role of communication in the new alternative model has changed. It advocates the two-way communication approach between people and the policymakers with a special emphasis to feedback. Communication strategy used in this model is mainly interpersonal communication along with the mass media. Desanayake in 1981 observed that mass media was employed for reaching out to the remotest villages and interpersonal communication was used to construct a common identity comprising shared experiences and values. Mass media, as noted by Rogers, was mostly for disseminating information about development programs and various schemes or policies. It emphasized that the receiver's understanding must be considered by the sender. This approach suggests that there is a shift of emphasis on the perspective of communication. Thus, we can say here that the communication system is participatory based and the focus is on the how it mobilized people for development. It gave rise to one pertinent question, that is it necessary to create pockets or groups of participation or the entire information be subjected to balanced participation? This open dialogue imitates towards varied views and experiences and also opened scopes for multidimensional flow of communication. The model also supported the fact that the participatory approach and mutual exchange of views reduces the distance between public and authorities. Rogers in 1976 has changed his stance in the new alternative paradigm regarding the diffusion approach, stating that for attaining development, both social as well as technological innovations are required. Participation of masses and the problem-solving attitude of the authorities are the two elements added by Rogers in the diffusion approach. According to him, communication was more important than the innovation. He pointed out that the approval or dismissal of a message depended not what was being communicated, rather it depended on how it was being conversed. The insertion of the human element indicates towards the concern and significance for human elements in the communication process. Moreover, prominence was given to social structure. Earlier, we noticed that the potential reach and implication of new communication technologies were limited to the Western world and the developing nations of Latin America, Asia, and Africa witnessed limited development scopes. Scholars suggested for a diagnostic stage in the alternative paradigm for evaluating the needs of the people and designing communication strategy for development. Thus, we can state here is that the alternative development encouraged participatory approach and two-way communication flow, and the function of development also changed in this model. This approach also rejects the idea of expensive and institutionalized media and emphasizes on the people-oriented communication model and participatory communication. Local organizations for growth and development. In the dominant paradigm of development, the importance of a local organization was initially ignored. Development experts opined that external sources can never completely influence the development of any community unless it mobilizes the masses and initiates the process of autonomous development. Well, while criticizing the dominant paradigm of development, one pertinent question arises, that is how the poor and marginalized people could make the system and authorities accountable to them. Rawling in 1982 assumed that changing power system in the social structure can increase the countervailing power of the masses. Non-aligned nations demanded for a new world information and communication order for decreasing the control of the world economy. Rajni Kothari, Director, Center for Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi, advocated that global problems and local solutions have become a survival condition for human development. He further stressed that the role of communication in the transnationalization of the world economic order and for human liberation and strengthening of cultures is considered vital. Writings of Mahatma Gandhi. Paulo Freire provided the motivation for self-reliant development. Barkin and McNulty in 1979, through their self-help development projects SHDP in the rural areas of Kenya, observed that local organizations are essential for speedy rural development. According to them, local organizations play a significant part in the producing a net transfer of resources from center to the rural areas. Moreover, it promoted entrepreneurial skills and local initiatives to foster an equitable distribution of wealth among the marginalized. Significantly, they provided organizational infrastructure for the development at the grassroots level. So, here in this context, we gather from the above points that local organizations can extract resources from the center and facilitate greater equality in rural areas. Local culture and religious groups can offer local activism as well as many influence the modernization process at certain times. Contradictorily, at other times, they may resist modernizing influence as well. The influence of the local culture varies as per change in the demographics and ecology. Wang and Desanek in 1984 suggested that local culture and religion are significant in providing a context to the growth process and to maintain the degree of stability in development. To sum up, we can say that there have been frequent calls for new multidimensional and flexible approaches to development, and another development has been a reaction of that. It had reconceptualized the role of local culture and religion in the transformation process. Conclusion. We learnt from this module that it was the 1980s that have witnessed a number of experts and theorists proposing alternative approaches to modernization as well as dependency paradigms of development. From the criticism of modernization paradigm and dependency paradigm, the alternate viewpoint of development emerged. Alternative paradigm considered development as a holistic approach, as it included cultural, social, indigenous and economic elements. The alternate development attempts to integrate advantageously a number of diverse ideas of development that has emerged in the past few decades. It includes people's participation, integrated grassroots and rural development approaches, productive use of natural resources, technological usage, fulfillment of people's basic needs, preservation of environment, etc. This model encouraged devising of strategies based on the feedbacks of local people and indigenous resources in consonance with the culture and traditions. In a developing setting, we notice that the communication flows usually in the top-down way and people are only inured to receive information. But alternative approach encouraged people to convey their experiences and values, opening up scopes for participatory communication. Concerns for indigenous cultural and grassroots organization were also found in the alternative paradigm for development. For more details, please read the module carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of each module. Thank you.